The courtroom was cold, almost sterile. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting sharp shadows on the wooden benches and polished floors. In one corner sat a young man, no older than 17, wearing a neatly pressed shirt that looked slightly too big for his frame. His tie was knotted perfectly, though it seemed more out of determination than habit. He clutched a stack of papers in his hands, flipping through them nervously but trying hard not to show it. This was Jordan Blake, a kid from a neighborhood most people only heard about in news stories. Gang violence, poverty, broken systems. But today he wasn't just another nameless face in the crowd. Today, he was standing up for himself. Across the room, Judge Harold Grimes adjusted his glasses as he scanned the docket. Known for his gruff demeanor and cutting remarks, the judge had earned a reputation over decades on the bench. People whispered about him behind closed doors. Some said he was fair but strict. Others called him something much worse. To Jordan, he was just another obstacle in a long line of obstacles life had thrown at him. When Jordan's case was called, he stood up slowly, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. As he approached the podium, all eyes turned toward him. Some were curious, some skeptical, and a few even amused. It wasn't every day you saw a teenager representing himself in court, especially in a civil matter involving accusations against local police officers. "Your Honor," Jordan began, his voice steady despite the nerves gnawing at him. "I'm here because I believe my rights were violated during an arrest last month." Before he could say anything else, Judge Grimes leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Young man," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "How old are you?" 17, Your Honor," Jordan replied politely. The judge let out a short laugh, shaking his head. 17? And you think you can handle this kind of case by yourself? He glanced around the room, sharing a smirk with the bailiff. A few members of the audience chuckled nervously, unsure whether they should join in or stay silent. Jordan didn't flinch. Instead, he squared his shoulders and looked directly at the judge. "Yes, sir. I've prepared thoroughly, and I understand the law well enough to present my argument." Grimes raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Well, we'll see about that. Go ahead then, son. Let's hear what you've got." As Jordan started laying out his case, referencing statutes and precedents, the mood in the courtroom shifted slightly. At first, the judge interrupted constantly, asking sarcastic questions or making snide comments under his breath. "Where'd you learn all these fancy words? Did you Google them last night?" he quipped once, earning a few stifled laughs from the gallery. But Jordan didn't rise to the bait. He kept his focus razor sharp, answering each question calmly and confidently. Every time the judge tried to trip him up, Jordan responded with clarity and precision. By the time he finished presenting his opening statement, there was a noticeable change in the air. While some still doubted him, others found themselves intrigued, even impressed by how composed and knowledgeable this teenager appeared to be. Still, Judge Grimes wasn't ready to give him any credit. Leaning back in his chair, he crossed his arms and gave Jordan a dismissive look. "All right, kid, you sound like you've memorized a textbook, but let's see if you can actually prove your point." What the judge didn't realize yet, what nobody in that courtroom realized, was that Jordan wasn't bluffing. Beneath his calm exterior lay years of relentless study, late nights poring over legal texts, and countless hours volunteering at a community legal aid center. For Jordan, this wasn't just about winning a case. It was about proving that someone like him, a young black kid from the wrong side of town, could stand toe-to-toe with anyone, no matter how powerful they thought they were. And so, as the proceedings continued, Jordan dug deeper into his arguments, methodically dismantling the prosecution's narrative while keeping his cool. The judge's laughter might have stung, but it only fueled his determination. Little did anyone know, the real story was just beginning. The courtroom felt heavier now, the air thick with tension. Jordan stood at the podium, his hands gripping its edges as he prepared to dive deeper into his case. But before he could speak again, the judge leaned forward, his face a mix of skepticism and irritation. "All right, kid," Judge Grimes said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's see if you can actually back up all this legal jargon." Jordan didn't flinch. He took a deep breath, glanced down at his notes for a moment, then looked straight ahead. What the judge, and most of the people in that room, didn't know was that Jordan wasn't just some random teenager trying his luck in court. His journey to this moment had been anything but ordinary. Years earlier, when Jordan was just 12 years old, he stumbled upon an old law book while helping his mom clean out their tiny apartment. It belonged to her late brother, who'd dreamed of becoming a lawyer but never got the chance. The book sat untouched for years until one rainy afternoon when boredom led Jordan to pick it up. At first, the dense language confused him. Words like precedent and statute seemed alien, almost like another language. But something about the logic behind the laws fascinated him. He started reading more, not because someone told him to, but because it made sense to him. Law wasn't just rules, it was a way to protect people, to make things fair. For a boy growing up in a neighborhood where fairness often felt like a distant dream, this idea lit a fire inside him. By the time he turned 14, he'd read dozens of books on constitutional rights, criminal justice, and civil litigation. He even began watching real court cases online, taking notes and studying how lawyers argued their points. His mother noticed the change. She'd come home from her double shifts to find him hunched over piles of papers, scribbling furiously or highlighting sections of text. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" she'd ask, exhaustion softening her voice. "I'm learning how to fight back," he'd reply simply without looking up. She didn't fully understand what he meant, but she saw the determination in his eyes. That look reminded her of herself, young, scared, yet unwilling to give up. So she encouraged him, even though money was tight. She bought him secondhand law books from thrift stores and let him stay up late to study. On weekends, she drove him to the library so he could access resources they couldn't afford at home. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep his dream alive. By 15, Jordan had already begun putting his knowledge to use. He volunteered at a local community legal aid center, where volunteers helped residents navigate issues like evictions, wage theft, and discrimination. At first, the staff hesitated to let him assist. They thought he was too young, too inexperienced. But once they saw how quickly he grasped complex legal concepts, they started giving him small tasks. Drafting letters, organizing documents, researching precedents. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave him a taste of what real-world lawyering looked like. One day, a woman came in desperate for help. Her landlord was threatening to evict her after she complained about unsafe living conditions. The staff was swamped, and no one had time to take her case. Jordan stepped forward. "Let me try," he said quietly. The head volunteer raised an eyebrow but nodded reluctantly. For days, Jordan pored over housing laws, gathering evidence and drafting a formal complaint. When the landlord received the letter, he backed off immediately. The woman burst into tears of relief, hugging Jordan tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my family." That moment changed everything for him. For the first time, he realized the power of the law and his ability to wield it. Word spread quickly among the neighbors, and soon people were coming to him directly for advice. Some called him the little lawyer. Others joked that he should skip high school and go straight to law school. Jordan just smiled and kept working. Back in the courtroom, Jordan's confidence grew with each passing minute. He cited case after case, pointing out inconsistencies in the officer's testimony. One by one, he dismantled the prosecution's arguments, weaving together facts and logic like a master craftsman. Even the opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing sideways at the judge as if seeking reassurance. Judge Grimes, however, remained stubbornly dismissive. "You're just repeating what you've read somewhere," he snapped during one exchange. "Anyone can do that." Jordan paused, meeting the judge's gaze steadily. "With respect, Your Honor, anyone should be able to do that. The law belongs to everyone, doesn't it?" A murmur rippled through the gallery. Some nodded approvingly while others exchanged surprised glances. No one expected this teenager to challenge the judge so boldly, and yet, here he was holding his ground. As the hearing continued, Jordan introduced a piece of evidence that caught everyone off guard. Internal police department memos obtained through public records requests. These documents revealed patterns of misconduct within the precinct, including several complaints filed against the very officer involved in Jordan's arrest. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Jordan laid out the connections between these incidents and his own case. Opposing counsel objected loudly, calling the evidence irrelevant. Judge Grimes frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "This is highly irregular," he muttered, glaring at Jordan. "Where did you even get this information?" "I followed the rules, Your Honor," Jordan replied calmly. "Just like anyone else would." The judge opened his mouth to respond but stopped short. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face. This wasn't just some kid playing lawyer, there was something different about him, something undeniable. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited anxiously for updates. They'd initially shown up expecting a routine hearing, maybe a few sound bites for the evening news. But as word spread about the teenager taking on the system, their interest intensified. Cameras clicked, microphones were adjusted, and notebooks flipped open. Inside, Jordan pressed on, unaware of the storm brewing beyond those heavy wooden doors. Little did anyone know, the biggest revelation was still to come. And when it did, it would shake the foundations of that courtroom, and perhaps the entire justice system. The courtroom was buzzing now, a low hum of murmurs rippling through the rows of spectators. Jordan stood at the podium, his posture unwavering despite the weight of the moment. He could feel the eyes on him, some curious, some skeptical, and a few tinged with disbelief, but he didn't waver. This wasn't just about proving his case anymore. It was about showing the world that someone like him, a kid who'd grown up in a neighborhood everyone dismissed, could rise above the odds. Judge Grimes leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable but clearly uneasy. For the first time since the hearing began, there was uncertainty in his demeanor. The internal police memos Jordan had introduced weren't just documents, they were proof of something bigger, something systemic. And as much as the judge tried to brush them off as irrelevant, they were impossible to ignore. "Objection!" Opposing counsel shouted again, his voice rising an octave higher than before. "Your Honor, these so-called patterns have no direct bearing on this case. It's inflammatory and prejudicial." Jordan didn't wait for the judge to respond. He turned toward the opposing lawyer, his tone calm but firm. "If systemic misconduct creates a culture where officers feel empowered to violate citizens' rights, then yes, it is relevant. My arrest wasn't an isolated incident, it's part of a pattern. And if we don't address the root cause, nothing will change." The gallery erupted into whispers. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in energy. Judge Grimes slammed his gavel down hard, demanding silence. "Enough," he barked. "I'll hear no more arguments on this unless they're directly tied to the matter at hand." Jordan nodded respectfully, though his mind was already racing ahead. He knew the next move would be critical. This wasn't just about exposing wrongdoing. It was about making sure justice prevailed. Taking a deep breath, he reached into his folder and pulled out another document. As he held it up, the room fell silent. "Your Honor," Jordan began, his voice steady, "I'd like to call a witness to testify about the culture within the precinct. Someone who has first-hand knowledge of the officer's conduct and the department's failure to act." Opposing counsel shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. There's been no prior notice of additional witnesses. This is completely improper." Jordan met the lawyer's glare head-on. "With respect, Your Honor, I filed the proper motion last week. It's all documented." The judge flipped through his papers, his brow furrowing. Sure enough, there it was, a motion buried among the pretrial filings. He sighed heavily, clearly irritated. "Very well. Bring in the witness." Moments later, a middle-aged man walked into the courtroom. His hair was graying at the temples, and his suit looked slightly worn, but his presence commanded attention. As he took the stand, Jordan introduced him, a former colleague of the officer involved in the case. The man had worked alongside the accused for years before resigning due to what he called unethical practices. "Can you describe your experience working with Officer?" Jordan paused, glancing at his notes. Officer Daniels? The witness adjusted his tie, his hands trembling slightly. Yes. Over the years, I witnessed multiple incidents where Officer Daniels used excessive force or made questionable arrests. When complaints were filed, they were either ignored or swept under the rug. It created a toxic environment where accountability was virtually non-existent. Opposing counsel jumped to his feet again. Objection, hearsay, Jordan countered quickly. Your Honor, this testimony falls under exceptions regarding patterns of behavior. It's admissible. Judge Grimes hesitated, his gavel hovering, mid-air. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. Overruled. Proceed. As the witness continued, detailing specific examples of misconduct, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. The jury leaned forward, their expressions shifting from skepticism to concern. Even the stenographer stopped typing for a moment, her eyes wide as she listened intently. Jordan pressed on, asking pointed questions that painted a damning picture of the department's failures. Each answer chipped away at the prosecution's credibility, leaving cracks in their narrative. By the time the cross-examination ended, the tension in the room was palpable. Opposing counsel sat fuming, flipping through his notes frantically, searching for a way to counter the damage. But Jordan wasn't done yet. Before the judge could move on to closing arguments, he made one final request. Your Honor, I'd like to submit additional evidence. Emails between senior officials discussing how to handle public complaints against Officer Daniels. These emails further demonstrate the department's deliberate indifference to accountability. Opposing. Counsel practically lunged out of his seat. This is unprecedented. We've never seen these documents before. That's because they were sealed until yesterday, Jordan explained calmly. I obtained them through a court order after proving their relevance to this case. The judge stared at Jordan, his jaw tightening. You've been busy, haven't you? Yes, Your Honor, Jordan replied simply. Because this isn't just about me. It's about holding people accountable when they abuse their power. The gallery erupted into murmurs again, louder this time. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks while members of the audience exchanged astonished looks. Even the jurors seemed shaken, whispering quietly among themselves. One of them, an older woman with sharp eyes, nodded approvingly, her lips pressed into a thin line. As Jordan returned to his seat, he allowed himself a brief moment to exhale. His heart was racing, but he felt a flicker of hope. He'd laid everything on the line, presenting not just his own story, but a broader truth about systemic injustice. Whether the judge and jury would see it that way remained to be seen. But he'd given them no choice but to confront the reality staring them in the face. Judge Grimes called for a recess, slamming his gavel down with more force than necessary. As the courtroom emptied, Jordan gathered his papers, his mind racing with thoughts of what came next. Outside, reporters swarmed the doors, eager for updates. Inside, the opposing counsel paced angrily, muttering under his breath. And somewhere, in the chaos, a retired attorney sitting in the back row watched Jordan closely. He'd seen hundreds of cases in his lifetime, but none quite like this. Something told him this teenager wasn't just fighting for justice today. He was paving the way for a brighter tomorrow. The recess had done little to calm the storm brewing in the courtroom. When everyone returned, the air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. Jordan sat quietly at his table, flipping through his notes one last time. His expression was calm, almost serene, but his mind was racing. He knew what he was about to do next would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone watching. Opposing counsel fidgeted nervously, glancing at his watch and then back at the judge. Judge Grimes, meanwhile, looked like a man who wanted nothing more than for this whole ordeal to be over, but there was no escaping it now. As the gavel struck and the session resumed, all eyes turned to Jordan once again. Your Honor, Jordan began, standing tall and addressing the bench. Before we proceed further, I'd like to present additional evidence that directly ties into my argument and clarifies a few things. The opposing lawyer groaned audibly, slumping back in his chair. Your Honor, this is getting ridiculous. How many surprises does this kid have up his sleeve? Judge Grimes shot him a sharp look before turning to Jordan. What is it this time? He asked, his tone laced with both frustration and curiosity. Jordan reached into his folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, just a plain document with an official seal stamped across the top. But as he held it up, the room seemed to hold its breath. This, Jordan said, his voice steady and clear, is a letter granting me special permission to practice law pro hac vice, and for this case only. Due to my extraordinary qualifications, the courtroom erupted into gasps and murmurs. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes while members of the audience exchanged wide-eyed looks. Even the bailiff, usually stoic and unflappable, leaned forward slightly, staring at Jordan as if seeing him for the first time. Judge Grimes blinked rapidly, his face reddening. What are you talking about? You're a minor. Jordan nodded calmly. Yes, Your Honor, I am, but under certain circumstances, minors can be granted temporary legal status if they demonstrate exceptional knowledge and capability. I passed the bar exam unofficially at age 16 through a state-sanctioned mock program designed for prodigies. Since then, I've been working under the supervision of licensed attorneys, including my mentor. He paused, letting the words sink in. I submitted all the necessary paperwork weeks ago. This letter confirms it. The judge snatched the document from Jordan's hand, scanning it quickly. His jaw tightened as he read. Opposing counsel stood, abruptly, sputtering. This is outrageous. There's no way. It's completely legitimate, Jordan interjected, cutting him off. And it means that everything I've done here today, from questioning witnesses to presenting evidence, is not only permissible but fully within the bounds of the law. For a moment, silence fell over the room. It was as though everyone was collectively processing what they'd just heard. A teenager, a child by most standards, had not only prepared a rock-solid case, but had also navigated the complex legal system well enough to secure special permission to argue it himself. It was unprecedented, almost unbelievable. Judge Grimes finally spoke, his voice strained. Why didn't you disclose this earlier? I didn't think it was relevant until now, Jordan replied evenly. My focus has always been on proving my case, not drawing attention to myself. The judge rubbed his temples, clearly overwhelmed. You should have informed the court immediately. This changes quite a bit. Jordan nodded respectfully. Understood, Your Honor. My apologies for any confusion, but as you can see, I'm more than qualified to handle this matter. As the reality of the situation sank in, the mood in the courtroom shifted dramatically. Some jurors exchanged astonished glances while others scribbled furiously in their notebooks. One juror, an older man who had initially seemed skeptical of Jordan, now watched him with something akin to admiration. Even the retired attorney, sitting in the back row, leaned forward, muttering under his breath, "Unbelievable." Outside, reporters crowded near the doors, straining to catch snippets of the unfolding drama. Word spread quickly. The teenager defending himself wasn't just some amateur. He was a certified legal prodigy. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward anyone leaving the courtroom, and social media lit up with speculation. Back inside, Judge Grimes called for order, slamming his gavel repeatedly. All right, let's move forward. Does opposing counsel wish to respond? The lawyer stood hesitantly, looking flustered. Your Honor, given these developments, I'd like a brief recess to review the implications. Denied, the judge snapped. We're already running late. Let's wrap this up. Jordan took a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and resolve. He'd laid all his cards on the table, and now it was up to the jury to decide. Still, he couldn't help but notice the change in the room. The mocking smirks were gone, replaced by expressions of respect, or at least acknowledgement. Even Judge Grimes, though visibly irritated, seemed less dismissive than before. When it came time for closing arguments, Jordan stepped up to the podium one final time. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case isn't just about me, it's about accountability. It's about recognizing when power is abused and ensuring that those who break the rules are held responsible. What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident, it's part of a pattern. And patterns don't fix themselves, they require action. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. Today I stand before you not because I want revenge or attention, but because I believe in justice. Real justice. The kind that doesn't discriminate based on age, race, or background. If we walk away from this without addressing the truth, we're sending a message that some people are above the law, and I refuse to let that happen. The gallery was silent, hanging onto every word. When Jordan finished, he stepped back, his hands trembling slightly but his head held high. For the first time since the hearing began, the atmosphere felt different, not hostile or dismissive but reflective. Judge Grimes adjourned the court shortly after, instructing the jury to begin deliberations. As Jordan packed up his papers, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning around, he saw the retired attorney from earlier smiling faintly. "Young man," the older man said, extending his hand, "you've made history today. Whatever happens next, don't lose sight of why you started this fight." Jordan shook his hand firmly, gratitude washing over him. "Thank you, sir. I won't." As he walked out of the courtroom, reporters swarmed him, shouting questions and shoving microphones in his face. But Jordan kept moving, his focus unwavering. He knew the battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that victory might actually be within reach. Little did he know, the ripple effects of his actions were only beginning to spread. The jury deliberations felt like they lasted an eternity. Outside the courtroom, reporters camped out in the hallway, their cameras trained on the door, waiting for any sign of movement. Inside, Jordan sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For the first time all day, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. The weight of what he'd accomplished was starting to sink in, not just the legal arguments or the evidence he'd presented, but the sheer audacity of standing up against a system that had never been kind to people like him. His mother arrived, shortly after closing arguments, slipping into the room with tears in her eyes. She didn't say much, just hugged him tightly and whispered, "I'm so proud of you." Those 4 words meant more to Jordan than anything else. They reminded him why he'd fought so hard, not for fame or recognition, but for the simple belief that fairness should exist for everyone, no matter where they came from. Finally, after hours of waiting, the jury returned. The 4-person stood, clutching a slip of paper in trembling hands. The courtroom fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Even Judge Grimes seemed unusually subdued as he asked the question everyone was holding their breath to hear. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the 4-person replied, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. Jordan's heart pounded in his chest. He locked eyes with his mother, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. Then he turned his attention back to the 4-person as she read aloud. "On the charge of wrongful arrest and violation of civil rights, we find in favor of the plaintiff." A wave of murmurs swept through the gallery. Some people clapped quietly, while others simply stared in disbelief. Opposing counsel slumped back in his chair, defeated. Judge Grimes nodded solemnly and announced the damages awarded to Jordan, a figure significantly higher than anyone expected. It wasn't about the money, though. It was validation, proof that someone had finally listened. As the gavel struck, one final time signaling the end of the trial, Jordan exhaled deeply. He hadn't dared to dream this far. Winning felt surreal, almost impossible. But here he was, surrounded by strangers who now saw him not as a kid from the wrong side of town, but as someone capable of changing the narrative. Outside the courthouse, chaos erupted. Reporters shoved microphones toward Jordan, shouting questions, faster than he could process them. Cameras flashed nonstop, capturing every expression, every gesture. He raised a hand, asking for quiet, and when the crowd settled slightly, he spoke. "This isn't about me," he began, his voice calm but firm. "It's about proving that justice can still be served, even when the odds are stacked against you. This case shows that accountability matters, and that no one is above the law." I hope this verdict sends a message to those in power that their actions have consequences." His words resonated deeply. Some reporters scribbled furiously, while others recorded video clips destined to go viral. Social media exploded within minutes with hashtags like the Teen Genius Attorney and Justice for All trending nationwide. People marveled at how a teenager had taken on a corrupt system and won. Memes and memes flooded timelines, turning Jordan into an overnight sensation. But amidst the frenzy, Jordan remained grounded. When asked about his plans, he shrugged modestly. "I'll keep doing what I've always done, helping my community fight for their rights. That's where my focus will stay." Back inside the courthouse, Judge Grimes sat alone in his chambers, staring at the empty seat where Jordan had stood just moments ago. The young man's performance replayed in his mind, the sharp arguments, the unshakable composure, the undeniable brilliance. For years, Grimes had prided himself on being a tough judge, someone who demanded respect and followed the rules to the letter. Yet today, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd misjudged Jordan entirely. He picked up the sealed document confirming Jordan's special legal status and reread it slowly. The signature of a senior appellate judge endorsing the teenager's abilities caught his eye. Grimes sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. Maybe he'd underestimated the kid. Maybe there was more to the world than he'd allowed himself to see. In the days that followed, the fallout from the trial rippled outward. Local news outlets dug deeper into the police department's history, uncovering decades of unchecked misconduct. Public outrage grew louder, prompting calls for reform. City officials scrambled to address the mounting pressure, announcing investigations and policy changes aimed at restoring trust in law enforcement. Meanwhile, Jordan became a symbol of hope and resilience. Invitations poured in, from prestigious universities offering full scholarships to organizations eager to feature him at conferences. Lawyers and activists reached out, praising his courage and offering mentorship. Even Hollywood producers called, pitching ideas for movies based on his story, but Jordan declined most of the offers. Fame wasn't what he wanted. Instead, he returned to the Community Legal Aid Center where his journey had begun. There, he continued mentoring younger teens, teaching them how to navigate the legal system and empowering them to stand up for themselves. His message was simple yet powerful. You don't need connections or wealth to make a difference. All you need is determination and a willingness to fight for what's right. One evening, as Jordan packed up his things at the center, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. It was the retired attorney who had approached him after the trial. He stepped inside, carrying a leather-bound book under his arm. "I brought you something," the older man said, handing it to Jordan. "It's a collection of landmark cases that shaped modern law. Thought you might appreciate it." Jordan flipped through the pages, his eyes lighting up at the annotations and notes scrawled in the margins. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "This means a lot." The attorney smiled faintly. "You've already accomplished more at 17 than most lawyers do in a lifetime. Keep going. The world needs people like you." As the man left, Jordan sat down and opened the book, losing himself in its contents. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But for the first time, he felt truly unstoppable, because he'd proven something important, not just to others, but to himself. Justice had been served, and Jordan Blake was just getting started. Weeks turned into months, and the whirlwind of attention surrounding Jordan began to settle. The headlines that once dominated news feeds gradually faded, replaced by newer stories vying for public interest. But the impact of what Jordan had done lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. His case wasn't just a courtroom victory. It was a spark that ignited conversations about fairness, equality, and reform across the country. Jordan didn't let the spotlight change him. Instead, he doubled down on his mission, helping others navigate the legal system and fighting for justice in ways big and small. He spent his days at the Community Legal Aid Center, guiding neighbors through eviction notices, wage disputes, and discrimination claims. At night, he worked tirelessly preparing workshops for young people, teaching them how to advocate for themselves and their communities. One Saturday morning, a group of teenagers gathered around a table littered with papers, highlighters, and open laptops. They were part of Jordan's mentorship program, designed to empower kids who felt voiceless. Some came from broken homes, others from neighborhoods plagued by crime and neglect. None of them expected much from life, or from adults like judges, lawyers, or politicians. Until they met Jordan. "All right," he said, standing at the front of the room with a marker in hand. "Let's talk about evidence. What makes something credible? How do you prove your point without relying on emotions?" The teens leaned forward, listening intently. One boy raised his hand hesitantly. "But what if nobody listens? Like, even if we have proof, people still ignore us?" Jordan nodded, understanding the frustration behind the question. "That's why we document everything. Write it down. Record it. Save every piece of evidence you can find. And when someone tries to shut you down, remind them that facts don't lie. It's not always easy, but it works." The boy smiled faintly, jotting notes onto his paper. For many of these kids, this was more than a lesson. It was a lifeline, a chance to rewrite their futures, one argument at a time. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of Jordan's case continued to spread. The police department faced mounting pressure to implement reforms, including mandatory training on racial bias and stricter accountability measures for misconduct. Community activists organized rallies, demanding transparency and systemic change. Even lawmakers took notice, introducing bills aimed at addressing disparities in law enforcement practices. At one such rally, Jordan stood quietly near the back, watching as speakers addressed the crowd. A woman holding a megaphone shouted, "This is what happens when we stand together. When we refuse to stay silent, the system has no choice but to listen." The audience erupted into cheers, pumping fists in the air. Jordan felt a surge of pride, not because he was being celebrated, but because real progress was happening. Change was slow, messy, and often painful, but it was possible. And he knew he'd played a role in making it happen. As the months passed, invitations poured in from universities, nonprofits, and advocacy groups eager to hear Jordan speak. Reluctantly, he accepted a few, knowing it was an opportunity to amplify his message. At one event, a national conference on youth empowerment, he delivered a speech that left the audience spellbound. "People ask me all the time how I did it," he began, pacing slowly across the stage. "How did a kid from the wrong side of town take on a judge, a cop, and an entire system? My answer is simple. I didn't do it alone. I had help from my mom, who worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, from mentors who believed in me when I doubted myself, from neighbors who trusted me enough to share their stories." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Justice isn't something you achieve by yourself. It's a team effort. It's about lifting each other up, sharing resources, and refusing to accept the world as it is, because the world can be better if we're willing to fight for it." When he finished, the room erupted into applause. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering as though they couldn't get enough. Jordan stepped off stage, overwhelmed but grateful. For every standing ovation, every handshake, and every thank you note, he remained humble. Fame wasn't his goal. Making a difference was. Back home, life carried on much as it always had. Jordan's mother beamed with pride whenever she saw her son featured in newspapers or interviewed on TV. "You're changing the world," she told him one evening over dinner. "Your dad would have been so proud." Jordan smiled softly, thinking about the father he barely remembered. "I just want to make things easier for people like us, so kids growing up where I did don't have to feel invisible anymore." His mother reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "You already are." By the time Jordan graduated high school, he had become a household name. Scholarships flooded in from top-tier universities, each promising to nurture his talent and provide opportunities most could only dream of. After careful consideration, he chose a school known for its strong law program and commitment to social justice. On move-in day, he hugged his mom tightly, promising to visit often. "You've got this," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Go show them what you're made of." As Jordan settled into college life, he quickly became a favorite among professors and classmates alike. His insights during lectures sparked lively debates, while his dedication inspired those around him. Outside of class, he joined student organizations focused on criminal justice reform, using his platform to raise awareness about issues affecting marginalized communities. One professor pulled him aside after a particularly heated discussion. "You know," he said, "you remind me of someone I once taught. She went on to argue cases before the Supreme Court. I think you're headed there too." Jordan laughed nervously, brushing off the compliment. "I'm just trying to learn as much as I can right now." The professor smiled knowingly. "Keep doing that and you'll go far." Years later, Jordan stood in front of a packed lecture hall delivering a keynote address on justice in the age of prejudice. The audience listened intently as he shared his journey. From the tiny apartment where he first picked up a law book to the courtroom where he proved himself against all odds. His voice carried authority yet warmth, reminding everyone that true justice starts with empathy and ends with action. As he concluded, he looked out at the sea of faces, many of whom reminded him of his younger self. "Never underestimate the power of one person to make a difference," he said, "because sometimes all it takes is one voice to start a movement." The room erupted into applause, echoing the sentiment that had driven Jordan since the beginning. He may have started as a mocked miner in a cold courtroom, but today, he was a symbol of hope, a living testament to the idea that brilliance knows no age, race, or background. And so Jordan Blake's legacy grew, not as a prodigy or a celebrity, but as a fighter for justice. A reminder that even in the darkest corners of society, light can shine through. All it takes is courage, determination, and a belief that fairness is worth fighting for.